Welcome to the Non-Essential Podcast. I'm Steve Gibson, and I almost forgot to count how to 3.
You forgot to count how to 3?
Yeah.
I'm Ben Matlock. Luckily, this show isn't about math at all. So
1, 5, 7, go. Launch.
Do we go on? Well, we're counting to 3. Do we go on 3 or do we go on 9? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Good start.
Well, yeah. Welcome to the Non-Essential Podcast. Every week, me and Steve get together and tell each other random shit. Last week, I talked about a living doll, and Steve talked about an asshole who he's going to keep talking about today.
It just keeps going.
Well, you should have been your own editor before you started us down this path.
Finally, it's one of those, we've talked about it, where like I wait till the day before the show to actually start. Like I'll do research, but I won't actually start doing notes until like the day before the show. So last week I'm like typing this up. I'm like, page 10. Fuck, I'm only a third of the way through this guy's story.
Next thing you know, it turns out like you're unintentionally writing a book about the fucker.
Right.
Yeah. So we'll have more of that today, but first, because I always go first. I don't know why we.
It would throw me off so fucking bad if one of these weeks you're just like, why don't you start off? I'd be like, what?
No, I like being the opening act.
Start strong is what they say, and then
or start weak and then tune out the rest of the show, contemplating like what went wrong with my part of the show while you talk about something. Today, my topic is a little bit more well-known. I think anybody who's followed like ghost or major crime history probably knows about this incident, but I wanted to talk about it because it's something that like had a really strong effect on me when I was a kid.
The Ronald McDonald House.
Yeah, part 2, assholes. You thought I wouldn't go back to this? Well, no. So when I was a kid, I watched an episode of that show, Scariest Places on Earth. And if you don't know about that show, it was really cheesy, and it was about, like, obviously haunted locations where they would kind of talk about, like, 2 or 3 places an episode. And what I kind of liked about it was they spent a good chunk of time on the history of the places and not a whole lot of time on, like, ghost hunting shit.
Yeah, like, instead of trying to be... If it's like, I've probably seen that one, but if it's like all the other, like I love those type of shows, just like the variety, like rant, kind of like our podcast.
Right.
But I love when they do that, when they're not going to try to like convince you that ghosts are real, but they're also not going to be like, haha, ghosts are dumb and they're fake.
Yeah,
but
it's not about
like spin, right.
It's not about like gathering evidence. It's like these people already believe this shit and they're just talking to each other in a circle or whatever. And like, I don't believe in ghosts, but I find ghost stories and stuff like that really interesting. And if there are ghost stories about a place, that usually means there's really interesting like folklore and actual history behind those places.
Right.
So you know, it's dumb entertainment. It's really cheesy. It's hosted by Linda Blair, like that girl from The Exorcist, so you know it's going to be good. It was
good to know she made it. I hadn't seen her alive after that movie. I thought maybe the devil got her, but
that was the thing. I saw the show before I saw The Exorcist, so I was like, hosted by Linda Blair, and I'm like, so who's that?
She in the Olympics or something?
Yeah. So it's a dumb show, but to me, it's not as bad as like 3 or 4 dipshits in like a pitch black house at 2 a.m. wondering why they're hearing like static in their cheap microphones that they've turned up all the way.
Orbs, there's orbs in these dusty old pictures.
And then the show, like I think later on they added like these reality show segments. So they would do their normal show, and then like the next half of the episode, they would send a family to one of these fucking places to do dumbass challenges. This was kind of like the peak of like the reality show era.
Yeah, that sounds like kind of Fear Factory. Like.
Yeah, and it was the same kind of camera setup where like these people would have to walk around with these dumb things strapped to their bodies with a camera pointed right at them. And it was always shit like, you light 6 candles to get the demons off you. And it was always like the same family too. So you would have like the wife who's like, I'm definitely spiritual, and I think we could do a lot of good for these spirits if we just go and do these things. And then like you would have the husband who's like a no nonsense firefighter fuck who's like, I don't believe in any of this shit, and I just want the money. And then like you would have the show, like they would cut away from Linda Blair, and it would be this guy Alan Robson, who's like he was the correspondent, but he always ran this reality show segment, and he's like, oh, you're gonna believe in this shit because these candles are all over the fucking house and you're gonna get haunted. It was really entertaining, and I still watch it like all the time in October. But anyway, I watched an episode about the Villisca Ax Murder House when I was really little, and it fucked me up for months. Like, I mean, like, I was crying until I fell asleep more often than not. For some reason, I moved my bedroom to the basement because, like, irrationally, I thought, like, maybe murderers would forget to check down there.
You know what? I had a friend that kind of did the same, although this was much more, he didn't move his bedroom to the basement, but maybe he did, but he was same type of mindset, and that's what we all gave him shit, because it's like, if somebody breaks into your house, the basement's like the one place you have no way out of, except for like the one.
Right. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, there's no logic to it. It was just like, well, maybe they won't check down there. Like, yeah, I had no like actual thought process behind it. It was just, don't be in my normal bed.
Axe murderer comes in. Nobody keeps their children in the basement. I don't have to even look down there.
Well, the barest logic I can muster is like at that house, the basement, like the steps were really long down, and it was like really dark, and you couldn't really see the basement unless you like went all the way down there. So it was like, well, maybe he would just think it's storage or something. But it was really fucked up. Like, I was really young, and I was so freaked out by this story that like I had like no choice but to philosophically come to grips with mortality. Like, it wasn't like most people, they have those thoughts when like a relative dies or they lose a pet or something. And to me, I had to like face it when like the idea that a fucking nut job could just come into my house and bash my face in with an axe at any moment.
Life is short. I could be sitting here watching Power Rangers and just get axed to death.
It could happen mid-episode here. You'll just hear a thwack, and then like, yeah, and honestly, you would probably keep talking about fucking Ollie. But it's weird. Like, that fear is still there today. Like, I'm not really afraid of death anymore, but that scenario still like gets me on edge. Like, if something goes bump in the night, I'm not thinking ghosts or anything like that. I'm thinking fucking home invasion and shit.
Oh, yeah. As a kid, you're always ghost, monsters, boogeyman, whatever. And I think life gets way the fuck scarier when you realize that stuff doesn't exist, but there is real stuff that does exist that it could actually be.
Like, turns out people are way worse than all those things you came up with in your head.
Right. So, like, when you were afraid of monsters, a part of your brain would always say, you know what, you're dumb. You might be afraid, but there's no monsters. And you'd have that internal, like, dialogue. It doesn't mean you weren't scared, but there was that other part there to kind of try to balance it out when it's like, oh, somebody's breaking into my house. There's the other part of your brain's like, yeah, probably. And you're like, well, fuck.
Yeah. It's so it is kind of like just a set-in phobia, I guess. Like, is it a phobia if I think like being murdered is a rational fear? But it is like, it was something that I really got hung up on as a little kid, and it did kind of affect how I saw the world a little bit. And it all started because I watched a stupid as fuck show talk about this goddamn house. And so I figured, why don't we, another stupid as fuck show, talk about this goddamn house?
Do I have to, like, I still got my webcam sitting here. Should I put it on me so I can be like, oh, what was that?
Yeah, we have to turn off the lights and shine a flashlight, like, right into our eyes.
Just, randomly throughout the episode as we're talking. Did you hear that?
Yeah, I should get some, like, good Halloween sound effects and stuff, just so people, like, think they're hearing bumps and shit while they try to listen.
If you stop the recording and play it back, you can kind of make out the sound of two idiots talking about stuff.
So early 1900s, Villisca, Iowa was probably everything you wanted your town to be back then. Businesses were on the come up, but there was still that sense of like a close-knit community where everybody seemed to kind of know everybody. Like anytime you watch a video or this show about what happened here, they always find these old timers who are just like, yeah, we used to leave the doors open and everybody waved to each other, and then this crime happened and no one talks to me. And it's like, yeah, because you were probably the killer, old lady. But the whole town would be rocked by this one crime that happened on a June night in 1912. It was a crime that ended up kind of becoming a permanent part of this town's identity, albeit kind of intentionally now. It's a big tourist sort of thing.
So turning lemons into lemonade. I gotcha.
Yeah, who knows when they made that switch where like, actually, this could be great for us.
Nobody trusts each other anymore, but fuck it, let's make some money.
So when you're talking about what happened here, it's important to remember that in 1912, serial killing and just like gruesome, disturbing murders like this weren't particularly common and known like they are today. Like America, we were always a violent people, but the stuff you heard about was usually stupid shit you could wrap your head around. Like you think like Old West and how violent it was. Like people weren't just killing each other completely like out of some sick need to murder. It was always like, drunken disputes and robbery and shit.
Mabel was cheating at canasta, so.
Right. What happened here, kind of predates the real fucking monsters like, Albert Fish and stuff like that by, at least a decade. So what actually happened that we know for sure? Lena and Ina Stillinger, age 12 and 8 respectively, went to church one Sunday morning in June, with the plan being to have dinner that night with their grandmother after the morning service. However, they were invited to spend the night at the Moore house after the Children's Day program at their church that night. The Moore family consisted of Josiah Moore, age 43, Sarah Moore, age 39, Herman Moore, age 11, Catherine, age 9, Boyd, age 7, and Paul, age 5. The Children's Day program went from 8 p.m. to 9:30, so I don't know why it's the day program, but and the family, along with the Stillinger sisters, walked home from the church after that. They estimate they probably got home around 10 p.m. The next morning, around 5 a.m., a neighbor woke up and began her chores for the morning. After a couple hours, she noticed that the Moores had not started their daily routine, having not stepped outside at all. Adding to this eeriness, the inside seemed unusually still. She approached the house, but nobody answered the door. She attempted to open it, but it was locked. The neighbor let out the Moore family's chickens and then called Josiah's brother Ross to come investigate. Upon arriving, Ross attempted to look into a bedroom window and knocked on the door, shouting for some sort of response. When that failed, he used a spare key he had been given and opened the door. When he entered the first bedroom, he saw two bodies, that of the Stillinger sisters, on the bed with dark stains on the cloths. He immediately ran outside and told the neighbor to call the sheriff. The rest of the family would be discovered in the upstairs bedrooms, all brutally murdered with an axe. The news traveled quickly throughout the town, and law enforcement quickly lost control of the crime scene. It said that up to 100 people were said to have somehow gotten into the house to gawk at the bodies.
Jesus.
Before the National Guard finally arrived around noon to cordon off the area and secure the scene. So the only facts coming out of the crime scene were these. 8 people had been bludgeoned to death. The axe was left at the scene appeared to be the only realistic murder weapon. They had all been in bed, if not asleep, at the time of their death, which they estimated to be around midnight. All the windows were covered. All the victims' faces were covered after their deaths. The axe was found in the Stillinger girls' bedroom, bloody, but there had been an attempt to wipe it. They did recognize that it did belong to Josiah, so the killer just grabbed it. The ceilings of the bedrooms had gouge marks, likely made from the upswing of the axe. A piece of keychain, oddly, was found in the downstairs bedroom with the Stillinger sisters. This is seemingly useless info, but it's probably the key to solving the whole case if this were a TV show. A pan of bloody water was discovered on the kitchen table, and there was a plate of uneaten food. All the doors were locked. There's a suspicion that Lena Stillinger might have been sexually assaulted. Her body, they noticed like she didn't have any undergarments and she had defensive wounds on her arm, meaning that she might have been one of the few people awake and knowing what was happening that night. The coroner reported that a 2-pound slab of bacon wrapped in a dish towel was on the floor in the bedroom near the axe. A second slab was found in the icebox, but that actually makes sense to me. I don't know why there's just...
Oh my God, there's more bacon in the fridge.
These guys have so much bacon. What happened here? But yeah, like a 2-pound slab of bacon just at a crime scene is very strange. Maybe the killer wanted that to be their thing. One of Sarah's shoes was found on Josiah's side of the bed with blood inside it. The coroner believed Josiah's blood had dripped into it, but then got knocked over when the killer returned to inflict additional blows. So it really, just a fucking violent bloodbath. Mm-hmm. It doesn't... We're going to talk about the suspects in a second here, but it's really strange. Like, one of the dominant theories is that it was kind of like a hit job, but it's so fucking brutal that you're, like, wondering, you have to imagine there was more emotion to it.
Yeah. I didn't mean to make that sound like I was disagreeing. That was like but no.
Yeah, well, I'm not.
I'm still processing all the clues with my
right
criminal justice background mind here.
Well, like and I'm not saying that it's impossible or whatever. And spoiler alert: if you didn't know about this case, it never got solved. So all we'll have is theories at the end.
Damn it.
The coroner's jury gathered a large number of witnesses, mostly relatives and neighbors, but not much came out of it. They confirmed Josiah's habit of locking the house up every night. Some neighbors claimed they heard sounds that night that possibly could have been from the murders. And nobody could really come up with any motive. Despite being one of Villisca's most prominent businessmen, Josiah didn't seem to have anyone who would want him or the family dead. That's not to say he didn't have potential enemies, though. While nobody was ever fully convicted for the murders, a good list of suspects were produced. The first one was Frank Jones. Frank Jones was Josiah's boss at the Jones store for several years before Josiah went off to open his own company in 1908. Jones was supposedly extremely upset with Moore leaving and taking the John Deere franchise with him. There was also a rumor that Moore had an affair with his daughter-in-law. One detective on the case openly accused Frank Jones and his son of hiring a William Mansfield to commit this disturbing act. Jones denied it, and no evidence has ever proved conclusively that he had any connection to what happened that night.
Yeah, like, I can see the whole idea, like, oh, he was working for me, but then he left and took this, now he's wealthy and I'm not, or not as wealthy.
Right.
But then... So you could see some motive there, but that doesn't seem like enough motive, even with, like, you throw in and he had an affair with my daughter-in-law. It's like, okay.
Right.
You usually still wouldn't be enough motive to tell some guy, hey, let's go butcher the whole entire family with an axe.
Right. Or maybe, like, I could totally see the scenario of being like, just, I don't care how you do it, just take them out.
Well, here's my other thing, too, and I hope this doesn't, like, encroach on... Well, you're talking. Like I said, I was trying to process all that because I was kind of joking about my background, but for those that don't know, I went to school for criminal justice and that kind of stuff. But really, I listen to a lot of these crime podcasts and whatnot. And my first thing is, if you're a hitman going there to kill people, you tend to not use a weapon that you just happen to find at the house. Because
I've played hitman, and let me tell you, you grab whatever you can. No, you're right.
Like you would think, if you're going to take out a whole family, you'd probably come equipped instead of like, well, let's just see how this plays out.
Yeah, that's kind of the weird thing about it. And you'll get the impression as we kind of keep going down this rabbit hole that the detectives, maybe they're right, maybe they were wrong, but it seems like they were kind of locked into this theory, like
that happens a lot.
Like they weren't very flexible about what they believed. And it all kind of centers around this Detective Wilkerson, who was kind of the lead.
Who probably fucking did it, asshole.
Yeah, he was probably guilty. But he was kind of pushing this narrative, whether it's true or not, So William Mansfield was a prime suspect for detectives. Mansfield was also known by aliases George Worley and Jack Turnbaugh.
Yeah. Normally when you have multiple different names that are not related, that makes you suspicious.
And Detective Wilkerson had a fucking hard-on for this guy that is, to be believed. Like, he headed up this investigation. He described Mansfield as a cocaine fiend and a serial killer. I don't know why he went with cocaine fiend first. One seems way worse than the other. He believed Mansfield had committed a similar brutal axe murder to his wife, infant child, and in-laws 2 years after the Villisca murders. And believed he actually committed another axe murder 4 days before the Villisca murders in Kansas, as well as another case in Colorado. So when I said, like, these crimes didn't happen often, it turns out I'm full of shit. Because it seems like they just didn't talk about them until this one. These crimes were all committed in a similarly brutal manner, indicating that it was the work of one culprit. And Wilkerson stated he had proof that Mansfield was present in all of these places on the night of the crimes. A key part of Wilkerson's belief of Mansfield's guilt was how no fingerprints were found at the scene. Which is a good, good evidence.
We couldn't find any fingerprints that don't link you to this scene, so...
You're right. So, like, his logic behind this, like, I can kind of see where he's coming from, but again, it's not proof. Fingerprinting was still relatively young evidence at the time. There wasn't that big of a database for it. So the detective believed that Mansfield would be one of the few people to commit this crime while wearing gloves because his prints were one of the few in their system. Not exactly proof, but, Wilkerson was just fucking sure this was the guy. Unfortunately, courts didn't see it that way, and William was let go due to a lack of evidence.
Oh my God, courts did something that made sense?
Right. And he would eventually actually win a $2,225 lawsuit against Wilkerson for his trouble.
Shit, and at the time, that's got to be at least $3,000 worth of...
Think of all the cocaine and serial killing you can get off.
Yeah. Wilkerson went on to overdose and die 3 weeks later.
Wilkerson believes this release was pressure from Frank Jones to get away with the crime and shift investigations to a Reverend George Kelly. So, yeah, if Mansfield and Jones did it, they got off. The next target was George Kelly, who was a traveling preacher who had just recently settled in Macedonia, Iowa in 1912. He was invited to the church events that day, and his early departure the next morning made everyone suspect him. He made a, quote, confession, but it's suspected the police got it out of torture and duress, and he withdrew it before his trial could begin.
The good old days when you could torture and duress people.
You're right. Not like now. We would never do that now. The first trial led to a hung jury, and he was acquitted by the second. He disappeared from the public eye after that. So Wilkerson's idea of a serial killer was certainly still a strong possibility, and some suspected one Henry Moore, unrelated to Josiah and his family. Henry Moore killed his own family with an axe in a similarly brutal fashion. Again, this doesn't happen that often, except apparently all the fucking time. Nothing conclusive ever came out to connect him to other similar crimes, though. They only got him on the murder of his family. The big idea among the town was that it was the work of some crazed transient. They certainly didn't want to believe one of their own did this, and one Andy Sawyer was a name that came up. In a nearby town, he seemingly just appeared one day with like muddy trousers, like looking really haggard. And kind of got a desperate job at a railroad company. And while he was working there, his foreman said that Andy took a big interest in the case, diligently reading the papers on it, asking if anyone had been caught. According to his foreman, Sawyer even told him that he was in Villisca that night and was afraid of being a suspect, so he immediately fled the town. And when he heard this, the foreman turned him over to the sheriff.
Well, I get both sides of that. Yeah, that's kind of... You'd think, though, if you were guilty, you wouldn't say that. You'd be like, "Oh,
yeah,
man,
like if you had nothing to do with it,
Ohio
I would never.
when that happened.
I would not mention I was there at all until, like,
see." And I'm just picturing some guy. He's this weird, like transient, probably penniless, obviously homeless person, and he's just like, that's the big news of the day, and he's just trying to like,
right. And fuck, everyone was interested in it. You
Right.
can't pretend like he was unique because he wanted to know who did this murder. Everyone was enamored by this crime. So before the sheriff arrived, the foreman claimed he actually approached Sawyer from behind, who was rubbing his head, and then suddenly just jumped up and said to himself, "I will cut your goddamn heads off," before making some violent swings with his work axe.
did he have any bacon in his pocket?
Yeah, if he has 2 pounds of bacon, you got your guy. Unfortunately to this theory, Sawyer was dismissed as a suspect when he could prove he was actually in a completely different town that night, having been arrested for vagrancy and put on a train by that town's sheriff at 11 p.m. that night.
Oh man, I love that. Like, you're under arrest for vagrancy. Get on this train, you hear?
Yeah, I would never be more happy to be arrested than if it got me off for murder. Like,
Well, that's true, yeah.
like that's pretty great.
Although that makes you think that he probably never fucking said he was.
Yeah, like this. Most
he's
of
a
that
scapegoat,
story.
yeah.
Most of that story seems like the foreman bullshitting. So there was another guy, a Joe Ricks, who stepped off a train with shoes covered in blood. But no connection could be made that he was in Villisca. So there's like a real well, why the fuck is there blood on your shoes? But he claimed he traded for the shoes with a tramp, and everything else about his story checked out.
A tramp.
Yeah, so find the tramp, you find your guy, right? And like most notable killings, there were plenty of confessions from already sentenced criminals. There was George Myers, who claimed credit for the axe murder of a family in Villisca, but he specifically said he took the lives of 6 people, which doesn't account for the 2 Stillinger girls. That would only count for the Moore family.
Well, maybe he left them alive, but they couldn't deal with what they had seen, so they axed themselves.
Yeah, that's usually how I commit suicide is,
By axe.
4 violent swings to my face, and then I put a blanket over me.
Right.
So who did it? Go ahead, Steve. Solve the crime right now. No. Who the fuck actually knows?
Butler did it.
Yeah.
Oh.
There are theories that the killer was in the house all day hiding and waiting. And also ideas that the killer was sent to kill another family and got the wrong address, which is
was it sent by that guy that we talked about a couple weeks ago? I don't even remember his name, but the
worst fucking organized crime boss ever. To me, that theory is like, man, fuck you. Like, if you're gonna brutally murder me, at least make sure I'm the guy you want out of the picture. Like, double check, you fuck.
The hard time I would have with that, they would make the axe thing make more sense, where you use a weapon that was found, at the home, because you'd have time, while they're at church or whatever, to find it. But I have a harder time believing somebody could hide in the home with 8 people in it after they got back and wait until they're all asleep and never be discovered. I mean, it's possible, I guess, but
the one thing, like the idea of like a random killing like this, the one thing that kind of sounds like to me, at least as far as the theory of like a guy just hiding in the house all day and waiting, it reminds me, like, there have been stories, especially I think in like Japan, where you read stories about like people hiding in like walls and then like killing whoever actually lives there when they get caught. So something like that may have happened. Like, these people were at church all day, so maybe like somebody fucking crazy.
Right, the opportunities there. And like I said, that would have given him time to be like, oh, hey, an axe, this will be handy.
Yeah, if they come back, I can fucking get out of here. But when it comes to who actually did it, maybe the most fucked up thing about this whole crime was how easy it was to get away with it back then. Like, not to say in a random slaying like this is some slam dunk case in 2018, but there are way more resources for investigators now than there was back then. Like, it was a real just like, fuck, like, we don't know who would have hated these people enough to do this. We don't really have like the resources to just get DNA evidence here. And Yeah, it's really fucked up. The Moore House has since, over the years gone through renovations, renters, upgrades. And then in 1994, it began an extensive restoration process to get it back to how it was, or at least as close as you could get
including dead
it.
bodies scattered along.
Right. We brought the bodies back. All historically accurate Moore House. As far as the ghost stuff, there's about what you would expect from a horrific murder site. Renters didn't like to stay there very long. The upstairs is said to be especially goddamn uncomfortable for people. There's ghost kids. Psychics with TV shows tend to lose their shit as soon as they enter the house. And some people think that the killer's ghost is also there because there has to be a sense of danger.
Well, I still think the killer is one of the dead people. They did it, and then they.
That's a strong theory. That criminal justice course really did wonders for you. It's a fucked up place, but the town has kind of rallied around it as like a prominent historical site now. Mostly embracing it as this like fucked up, but arguably most popular part of the town's identity.
Isn't it weird though? Like, I mean, it makes sense because it's a horrific thing. It's terrible. Obviously, but once you go a couple generations, so that the people that themselves that were the victim are removed from they were still people, but they weren't like, oh, I talked to that girl at school last week.
Right?
Nobody knows them at this point because we're generations past. Then all of a sudden it goes from being like this horrible tragedy to be like, this is cool. Let's go check out the place where those people were slaughtered.
Right. It's like, it's a really weird story because like I remember talking about it in like third grade to like my teacher, and my teacher was like a really nice old lady. I liked her a lot, but she was I kind of told it to her as like hoping that like kind of this teacher I really liked and respected would kind of reassure you that everything would be okay. And instead she told me how she knew the fucking Stillinger girls, and like. And I was just like, are you fucking for real? Like, that's making it hit, like, even closer.
She did it. Nah, I'm changing my answer. It was her. It was your teacher.
We're on to you.
You know what's interesting about these? Because this isn't the first, like, axe murder of an entire family that we've ever... Like you said, apparently back then it was pretty common, too. You would think after, like, the first person gets an axe to them... everybody else would fucking wake up, and there'd be like at least signs of an entire house worth of people fighting back. But like,
well, I mean, like I said, there were neighbors who claimed to be like they heard moans and stuff. And
yeah, but I mean, like if there was 8 total, right?
Right,
and they were all found in bed or around their bed or near their bed.
So like the 2 Stillinger girls, it's like they're downstairs. I can kind of see like they're kind of away from everything.
Sure.
Who knows if they died first or last? As soon as you like
axe the husband next to the wife would at least like jump out of the bed. But what happens? I mean, you're fucking sound asleep, and if you take an axe blow to the head while you're asleep, you don't necessarily wake up and say, "Ow,
right.
Why are you axing me?" Because if you even survived a hit,
right?
Yeah. So it's weird, but I mean, just picturing something like this happening and nobody being alerted in time to like fight back or stop it,
right? And you also got to think like Josiah, the father, like he was apparently well known to be like he made sure his house was locked up tight. So you have to imagine like his family knew that. So even if you heard something, you're probably thinking like, oh, somebody must have just like rolled over, or they got up for something real quick, or like you're probably thinking like you're safe.
I suppose back then, too, we talked about it before, how communal everything was. If you hear a bunch of grunting, you're just like, oh, man, mom and dad are going at it again. I'm not opening my eyes.
It's like, God damn it, can't we get a bigger house so I don't have to hear this shit? Why'd you wait until we had a sleepover to do this, mom and dad? So that's the Villisca Ax Murder House. Like I said, fucked me up, probably forever. But yeah, it's a damn interesting case. If nothing else.
It really is. Like I said, I keep the one thing that I keep going back to is that axe. It's unusual to go in ahead of time with like a premeditated thing. Now it could be completely like it doesn't discount any of the just serial killer or just crazy like psycho things, but I have a very hard time believing it was a hit or like an intentional,
Right.
We're targeting this family for this, but
Yeah, but
weird.
But you don't know anything about cocaine fiends, Steve. We use whatever we can get our hands on.
All right. So my stuff, like you said, is a continuation of last week. Last week I introduced you to Napoleon Hill, a fraud and a cheat who overcomes failure by simply denying that it ever happened.
Not a bad strategy.
No, apparently it works really fucking well. I'm going to kind of blast through this because I wanted to sum up, but my summary is like a page and a half. So as an 8-year-old, Napoleon was a lovable scamp who spent his time running around town shooting things with his pistol, the rapscallion. His stepmother tamed him and urged him towards a wholesome career of writing blatantly false stories for the newspaper. He met his first love when he was 15 and got her pregnant. The girl's father forced him to marry her, but they promptly divorced, and he'd spend the rest of his life pretending it never happened. He took a job for a coal magnate I can't say that word. Coal guy. Owned a lot of money in coal. Where he earned promotions by apparently dressing nicely, having great posture, and covering up for murder for a high-ranking coworker. He met another love of his life, had a daughter, but never spent time with either of these because he was too busy taking jobs in faraway cities where he'd make frequent visits to prostitutes.
The other loves of his life.
His life, right. But that was probably for the best because when he was around his wife and daughter, he was often abusive. In fact, things got so bad that at one point he kidnapped his daughter and threatened to leave the country with her.
It's certainly, you always hurt the love of your life forever, all the time, if you really love them.
Right. So his wife did get the daughter back and promptly divorced him, thank God. He was accused of check forgery, though he got acquitted of that crime. He ran a credit scam that pissed off literally the entire lumber industry in Alabama. He was under investigation by the U.S. Postal Service for fraud. He had multiple lawsuits and warrants filed against him. So he left town and founded the automobile construction school in Washington, D.C. There he met the third love of his life, who was currently attending class in a local high school. And then he promptly and quietly wed her just 1 week after she graduated. While the two were away on their honeymoon, many of his business partners took that opportunity to get the hell out of the business partnerships that they were in and cut all ties with him. When that school that he had founded was exposed for the scam that it was, he promptly turned it into a different scam. And that too would implode and leave him in debt to both the bank and his wife's wealthy family who had helped finance the endeavor. So that catches us up to where we left off last week.
Behind a car getting shot at, Ollie Hill is wondering what went wrong.
Yeah, as you can see, like I said, if you talk to him at this point, he's been nothing but a success. And every successful, wealthy person in America, he was right up there with them. And that quick synopsis shows you why he would think that, because he's been so good. So after Napoleon's automobile school failed for the second time, he and his wife Florence moved to Lumberport, West Virginia, where Florence's family lived. Napoleon took a job with the Lumberport Gas Company, but after a short time he grew bored because, doing honest work is boring, and he decided to move by himself to Chicago. That would be a pattern that we'd see quite often, where he'd just have to take these jobs that were just happened to be in completely different cities and mostly states from his wife and kids.
Yeah. Honey, let me go take care of this forever. Bye.
Now, when I introduced Napoleon last week, I kind of mentioned that he's considered one of the most important founders of the free thinker self-help movement, which apparently is a thing. The part that I didn't mention is that the Napoleon Hill Foundation still exists today, and they act as the keepers of Napoleon Hill's mythos. They're evangelical almost believers who revere and, of course, just happen to periodically republish his works.
You're going to get us into some real fucking trouble, aren't you, Steve?
Probably.
We got a fucking cult now
No.
that's going to freak out because we talked shit about Honest Ollie.
Honest Ollie. I like it. I saw you tweet that. I'm like, man, I wish I would have come up with that.
I used it on the show last week, too.
Well, I don't listen to you on the show.
That's fair.
And as I mentioned last week, there are two stories to Napoleon Hill. There's the story of what history suggests actually happened, and then there's a story I put according to Napoleon, but it's really according to the Napoleon Hill Foundation, who bases their history of Napoleon on a lot of his autobiographical stories and a lot of things that he wrote throughout his life. So when we're getting two conflicting stories of what happened, it's because one's coming from Napoleon and the people that revere him, and one's coming from actual reality. And
it'll be your job as the listener to try to determine from what source.
Spoiler alert, it'll be a really fucking easy job. According to Hill's biographer, the decision to move to Chicago and leave his wife back with her family was a pattern that they romanticized it this way. They worded it, well, Hill's habit of leaving his family to pursue work elsewhere was simply the price that he'd pay on his quest to make his own fortune his own way. Sure that's the case, and it probably had nothing to do with the prostitutes.
That's usually how I explain prostitution to my significant others. Is just, I'm just, I'm forging my own path, honey. You got to let me go my own way. What a piece of shit.
Shit, yeah. So with the help of a referral letter from his in-laws, Hill would get a lot of help from his new wife's in-laws, as it turns out. Or not her in-laws, but her family. Hill would land a job in Chicago at the LaSalle Extension University. Shortly afterwards, he would make up some letterhead, or have made up for him some letterhead that read Napoleon Hill, attorney at law. Which is interesting because that was not his job, nor had he ever gone to law school. But there's no evidence that Hill actually ever practiced law or performed legal services for anyone. So the purposes of this letterhead remain a mystery, quote unquote. It's pretty safe to say that everything that this guy's ever done is underhanded and just fraudulent. So if he does something that doesn't make sense, it's safe to assume that it's tied to some fucking scam that he's running. And I've got my theories on this letterhead, but I can't get into it. There's just too much stuff. After less than a year at his actual honest job there at LaSalle University, he quit. Instead, he decided to go in with a handful of partners and purchase the Martha Washington Candy Company, which they renamed the Betsy Ross Candy Company. He would be the president of said candy company, but it wasn't long before his partners persuaded him to leave. According to Hill, they had him arrested on false charges, of course, but then offered to settle out of court as long as he'd give up his share of the enterprise.
They agreed to stop hitting him with the hammer. As long as he agreed to never be seen again. Sounds like basically
he was committing more fucking fraud, and they turned him in for it and said, look, we'll not send you to jail if you just leave the damn company.
Just fuck off. You're the worst president ever. All you had to do was not commit fraud.
Oh, shit, I committed fraud on the first day.
Commit fraud, and when people write about you, they'll say president.
According to Hill, though, about 5 years after he was forced out, he'd win a victory against his former partners in a civil hearing and get awarded some kind of monetary judgment because, this was all a scam to push him out. The world against me, the guy trying to do it honestly.
How dare you scam me? Me?
Me? I invented scams. I mean, no, I'm honest. I mean, yeah, forget I said that.
This is the most dishonest scam I've ever come across.
So, regardless of what actually transpired at the candy company, when that didn't work out, Hill decided to start yet another school, this time founding the George Washington Institute in Chicago, which he likely founded with more money from his wife's family. They don't know for sure where he got the capital, but that makes the most sense that they just said, oh, by the way, Mom and Dad, love you. Can I have some more cash?
You know how you always said don't start another school? Well,
funny thing that this school would teach the principles of success and self-confidence. He'd use the school to urge his students to write to the local newspapers, letters talking about Hill's astounding race for a seat on the U.S. Congress. Fortunately, he never appeared to run for Congress because he probably would have fucking fit right in.
Yeah, he probably would have won. He would have been a president.
We'd be living in the United States of Ollie right now, but students, shockingly, and when I say anytime I say shortly thereafter, all this shit happens within, like, none of his ventures last more than like a year and a half. They very quickly don't work out for some reason.
He's like a machine gun of success. Just right. Rapid fire projects.
Pow, pow. But quickly, students began complaining that this unaccredited school for success was actually a fraud. In retaliation, Hill said he reported one of his German-American students to the FBI for suspicious activities, and so the FBI locked up the student for the remainder of World War I.
What a fuck.
So, like, right.
Oh, you fucking narc.
Well, I like that he's bragging about that. Be like, call me a fraud, eh? Well, I'm going to be completely fucking racist. Take that.
You fucking toolbox. I hate this guy so much. Like, I hated him before, but God, dude, like the only way this ends well is like him getting hit by a bus that knocks him into another bus.
But it wouldn't actually happen because he would claim it otherwise.
Yeah, he would claim like
here
no.
Doesn't lie, Ollie Hill. He was not killed by a bus.
I was working on a new means to fly.
So yeah, the students start to complain. He apparently does this racist thing against a German student. Although the good news is I don't know that there's much evidence that ever actually happened. It's just one of his many things that you'd make up to brag about, but that's a weird one. About the same time, Hill's obviously running out of money as he takes to the newspapers to, I guess, through editorials or something, to claim that he's planning on suing the Illinois Central Railroad for inadequate lighting on their train cars, claiming that he's always had perfect vision, but after just 1 month riding in these dimly lit rail cars, I now need glasses.
Bullshit.
Yeah, a lawsuit was never actually filed. At that time, this would have been in the 20s, 1920s, frivolous, like, civil suits were... That's like when they really started coming into their own, thank God. Where would we be without those?
Yeah, without every minor thing leading to having to see some dipshit in court.
Right. So he was trying to get on that wagon, and presumably some actual attorney laughed at him and said, get out of my office.
You know what? That actually, like, it kind of makes me miss the era of the duels. Because the people, like, who want to go to court for every little fucking thing were the same people who would want to get shot over every minor insult. So it's like, maybe that was the better way.
Right. It would have wrapped this up so I didn't have to, like, go for 3 episodes on this guy. So, anyway, the government soon became interested in Napoleon's school, and not because it was a good school, but surprisingly, because it seemed to be a front for fraud. As it turns
Mr.
out,
Napoleon, it looks like this isn't a cool school.
Like you claimed. In fact, all your students are squares. I'll show you, evil D. Wait.
Oh, shit.
As it turns out, Napoleon wasn't particularly interested in running a school. What he was interested in, however, was inflating the apparent value of the school and then selling uncertified stocks in the company. Basically, he valued his school at $100,000, and it was really like the government came in and they're like, we're doing the math here, Ollie, and
we don't.
You'd be lucky to get $1,200 out of this.
We don't know what you actually do here.
Right? Literally, I'm sure they had that conversation.
There's not value in anything you've done ever.
So, as it turns out, saying your company's worth 100% or 1,000% more than it actually is, and then selling stocks like that you just make up on, like, napkins. I think he's going to the diner and just writing one stock. Here you go. Apparently that's illegal. So
no shit.
But in the course of that investigation, they figured out that Hill had also set up a shell company called the First National Trust Association. This was a business that would offer loans with a reasonable 5% interest rate to students that wanted to attend his university.
This is called layering, all right? You keep making up businesses. Make it that tunnel go so deep they can't possibly get to the end of it.
I think by the end, this guy owns more businesses than Disney, but so basically he creates this company to offer student loans at a 5% interest rate. to pay for these students' tuitions. But because it was his school that he was making up and wasn't even a real school, he wasn't actually lending any money out. So basically he was charging 5% interest for nothing, which a lot of places do. I think if he would have been forthright with it and said, look, either pay up front in one lump sum or you can do installments at 5%, that'd be perfectly legal. But pretending to make, tuition loans in a company that you also own and then charging interest was a little shady.
Oh, I had no idea.
Warrants were issued for Hill's arrest. He agreed to turn himself in, but then failed to show up. He did show up 4 days later to post his $2,000 bail. I know you wonder where he got that $2,000 from, right?
No. I just assume more fucking bullshit. Mm-hmm. No, I'm sure he had a savings jar in case anything ever went down.
Emergency bailout fund. Engage. It's not clear if they made him pay the student loans back or whatever, but once again, his businesses were done and he was out of money. Oddly, though, Hill's later accounts of this period, basically when he's 30 years on and he's going back writing his biography and talking about his life.
He erases all this and just describes like the Rocky montage. I was training on a mountain.
So instead of talking, this whole phase, these 2 years would just disappear. Instead, he'd make one of his most outlandish claims. He says that during this time, he was approached by then-President Woodrow Wilson, who desperately wanted Hill to come work for him in an effort to end World War I. Hill boasts that the president was so desperate for his services that he offered him a hefty salary if only he'd come to Washington. But ever the patriot, Hill decided he must accept this job, but he refused to take even a penny for his services. How could I charge my country for doing my civic duty?
That is oh my god, dude. Like he's like you ever hear somebody just lie to you and it's like such fucking huge bullshit lie that you can't even talk to them?
I was gonna say, I've totally met people that reach this level of bullshit, but to the point where, like, as they're talking, you feel bad because you feel like they have to have some kind of mental illness.
Right. You're completely fucking insane.
So this guy who history can prove was penniless decides that he's going to take this job but turn down money.
Well, no, Mr. President, I would never let you suck my dick to get you out of World War I. That's ridiculous. I'll help for free.
So he claims he did go to work for Woodrow Wilson. He claims to have helped create propaganda materials to encourage the companies at home to keep working hard to support the war effort. I don't know what that means, but the support war effort I get, but whatever. I don't know what exactly. I know. He's going to be intentionally nebulous on what he actually did because he didn't do anything.
But he wasn't there. He was fucking dealing with his fucked up school.
Right. Which has hard evidence that actually happened because he was in court and in the papers and whatnot. But instead, this is where I was. The best part is that he claims that he was actually in the president's office the day that they received word that the Germans were ready to surrender. The president, after reviewing the terms of the surrender, asked Hill to review the United States response. And then he asked Hill if he would add anything, where Hill smartly quipped, "Yes, ask them if these are the wishes of the people or merely the wishes of the warlords. This way, they'll know to get rid of the Kaiser before signing their armistice." And Wilson, of course, thought that was a brilliant quip and put it in the response, and that's why the Kaiser was removed from power. Because
I fucking hate him.
This is the first time in the history of war that a losing side had their leader removed.
I would not, it's funny to me that they're, revising it this way, because I would not want to admit I had anything to do with the end of World War I, because it led to World War II. You fucking dipshit. That was not, you nailed him. No, you dipshit. It fucking went horribly wrong from there.
My favorite part was how that was worded, because that is at the time all those society types where they thought they were being cunning and witty, and it's the driest, most piece of shit response. Is this the wishes of the people or merely the wishes of the warlords? Well, no, fuck. Of course the people want to quit fighting the war. They're the ones getting killed.
Yeah. Would you stop making smug fucking Facebook posts and like actually fucking just take the goddamn surrender?
So anyway, back in reality, after his school in Chicago failed, Hill formed the Golden Rule magazine. He'd actually form a number of magazines all based around giving sound business advice, because who's better qualified?
A fucking bug. Jesus.
In his magazines, almost all the articles are written by Hill himself, and it's easy to prove because he's got a very distinctive like writing style, which is terrible. But in the magazine, he'd write under a variety of names to make it appear like there's multiple, journalists writing for his magazines.
Not a bad idea. We should have done that when we had a video game website. Just different authors, but it's just you and me.
Good point. Damn it. As it turns out, I know you might be thinking otherwise, but these magazines did not give sound business advice. In fact, they often did the exact opposite of that, to the point that the Federal Trade Commission got involved.
I never knew I could have so much money until I went to Ollie's school.
Pretty much, except for instead of... he's branching out a little bit here. Instead of like propagandizing himself, he partnered up with a family in Texas who owned oil companies. He would feature this husband and wife team and their company in his publications, wildly inflating the value of their stocks and talking about how good their current financial situation was and how the oil industry and this particular company was just, it's getting ready to take off any day, guys. Look how good it's already doing. That kind of thing, trying to persuade people to buy stocks, but based on complete lies. He also would say that for every stock purchased, a percentage of that purchase would go into a trust for the purpose of paying scholarships for returning war veterans. I claim that they had over $1 million, and this is in like 1920s money, in this trust. But of course, there was no trust. And shockingly, the government frowns on lying about part of your purchase going towards a donation when it's not. You might think it's funny that Hill would call one of his magazines the Golden Rule.
I don't think anything is funny about this fucking guy. I hate him so goddamn much.
If you happen to not be familiar with the Golden Rule, or what people refer to that, it says do unto others as you'd like them to do unto you, or whatever.
Rob 'em blind.
It's even better. Hill did firmly believe in the Golden Rule. In fact, he would cite it often throughout his life, except not that Golden Rule. Hill's version of the Golden Rule was that you should always do kindnesses for other people, because then they would be in your debt, and that gave you an advantage over them.
This was summed up with dollar bills, y'all. The Golden Rule.
His Golden Rule was literally do something for somebody, so then they have to fucking do something for you. That'll give you the advantage.
The Golden Rule for sociopaths.
He'd go on to create the Golden Rule Medal, an award that he'd bestow by running polls in his magazines, and then presenting the award to the often famous winners. But oddly, these winners would have more votes than his magazines really had circulation. In reality, this was a way that Hill came up with to get his name in papers alongside these famous people and individuals he wanted to be associated with. So, basically the paper would run the story.
It's a publicity stunt.
Right. And then and this was the kind of guy that after the fact, you'd look back and say, like, look, I'm associated with this.
I gave Steven Seagal the medal.
Here's a fun for instance. He once awarded the medal to somebody and then showed up at like a charity event that this person was going to be at and more or less ambushed them to like give them the award. Basically like, congratulations, you won the Golden Rule Award. And this somebody had no idea what the fuck he was talking about or who he was. But because it was a big event, as he's standing there next to him, he got his picture taken and it would end up in the paper and he'd end up circulating this picture often.
Right.
The person he was standing next to was one Thomas Alva Edison. And the caption that he would use with this photo, and I quote, I was going to try to do this in a great, like, old-timey newsman voice, but I can't fucking do that. But the caption that went with this photo would say, Two of America's famous men, Thomas A. Edison, left, and Napoleon Hill. Mr. Edison is the inventor of the talking machine, the electric light, and the moving picture, and scores of other things that serve mankind. Mr. Hill is the editor of Napoleon Hill's magazine and the New Philistine magazine.
And hasn't done anything worth a fuck for humanity.
He left that part out, weirdly. And he believes in making the golden rule the rule of all human contact. Edison was born of poor parents and began his career as a news butcher on a train.
This guy's like the Dalai Lama for fucking scam artists and dipshits.
Right. Hill began as a laborer in the coal mines. Both have risen to fame through their own efforts. And I love that last line, both have risen to fame. And people are like, who's Hill? Oh, I guess he's famous. Because, you know, when you're famous, the definition of famous is you have to tell people who you are. Anyway.
What a fucking prick. God damn it.
Hill then formed the Intrawall Correspondence School, which was theoretically a charity. The idea was that the foundation would raise money through donations in order to provide education and training to men behind bars, so that when they were released, they'd be, you know, productive members of society. It's a theory that I actually believe in, but it doesn't get carried out very well even today. Hill would even go so far as to petition for an inmate by the name of Stork, who was serving time for check forgery, which, as you remember, Hill's been accused of. He'd petition for this guy to be released, and he was, on the condition that he headed this charity. So for about 2 years, Hill would travel the country raising money for the school. They'd sell subscriptions to magazines, presumably the same type of deal, like, oh, you know, if you buy this $10 magazine subscription, $3 will go towards this school. They'd accept payments for course materials. So, oh, you can buy them books. And guess who wrote those books and therefore made all the money from that? Or he was always a fan of just like accepting cold, hard cash money. Before long, however, and again, this means within like a year and a half, articles began to circulate pointing out that none of the money collected had actually gone to anything. Hill, whose recent cross-country trips had actually served a dual purpose of collecting money while constantly running from creditors and law enforcement, for his part, he was shocked by these allegations. Of course the money had gone to the schools. If anything shows otherwise, why then, you know, now that I think about it, the program is being run by a man who had done jail time for this kind of thing.
I'm going to fucking hit him with a club. Like,
yes, Hill pinned all the blame on the very inmate that he had probably planned on all along, getting out of jail to run the program. And so Stork went back to jail. Hill bounced around. Right.
God damn it.
And I'm not saying there's a chance that there was some other people also involved with this thing, and maybe they were pocketing some of the money, but this was Hill's scam. It wasn't them. You know, he wasn't this innocent, like, my gosh, my golly, where did the money go? But when you put an ex-con at the top of the organization, you go back, oh, well, must be the ex-con.
Right.
He'd bounce around the Midwest for a bit. At that time, there was a journalist in Canton, Ohio, named Donald Mellett, who had made a name for himself for his scathing articles exposing the mob and police corruption. You know, when we see these movies about the mob, it's easy to kind of forget that there was a time when, you know, the mob's still around, but the mobsters and gangsters, you know, that was an actual thing, like a very, very widespread.
They were like prominent power structures in communities and stuff.
Right. And like I said, arguably they still are, but anyway, he's a journalist that made a name for exposing this and the police corruption associated with it. But about this time that Hill's just bouncing around, this journalist, Donald Mellett, was assassinated. Shockingly, it was either the mob or the police, or probably both. And of course, it outraged the journalistic community. It kind of made me sick writing this part because it's very similar to something going on literally right fucking now. But anyway, that made it a topic that was very popular because when you piss off journalists, they tend to write about stuff, which is likely why Napoleon Hill was quick to associate himself with Mellett. In fact, Hill would say that he and Mellett were close friends and that Mellett had been working with Hill to raise capital to fund Hill's 8-part self-help series.
This guy would have like fucking 50 Kickstarters going at the same time. Like,
and they'd all be ones that mentioned, be like, oh, this is a Kickstarter that when I mentioned it to Dave Grohl, he said it was cool. And by the way, President Obama likes it too. You know, he just make up that shit. Hill said they were so close that they're actually so like good of friends that Hill was also targeted for assassination on that morning. But thanks to dumb luck, he never ended up driving to work like he normally does, and he avoided the ambush.
This guy is the worst fucking liar ever, because he always adds this shit to his stories that like makes him look worse. Because that you add that, you know, if you add that, I'm thinking like, oh, you killed him. Like you had something to do with it.
Well, I just like that his thing was like the whole like fucking sitcom, like, oh, they were waiting outside by my car to shoot me, but I walked to work that day and left out the back door. But
I didn't dab after I finished in the bathroom, so I had a little piss on my pants, so I missed my car. You're like, what are you fucking bragging about, douche?
Well, and it all hinges on the idea that the mob would be like, well, fuck, we missed him. Guess he lives.
Well, yeah, can't get Ollie Hill now.
So after this, he would, you know, claim this association. He would go around the Midwest giving talks and testimony like against the corruption in the police and the KKK, who actually were, I know that sounds random, but the Klan figures into all this shit with the mob and the police.
Might as well fucking make a full clusterfuck out of it, you know? Just get everyone in there.
In real life, if you go back through the history, I didn't want to go into it because it comes.
I thought you meant it tied into Hill. I was like, all right, fine.
Well,
fuck it.
Hill did eventually give testimony in court against some Klansmen for something, and then he went into hiding, which was probably smart.
Yeah, all right, yeah.
And it is one of the rare times in all of this that Hill's account of going into hiding and the actual like doing any investigation, you realize, yeah, he was fucking in hiding at this point. But it's unclear if he was hiding from the mob and the Klan, which they probably weren't thrilled with him.
I'm not thrilled with him.
So, I was going to say, more likely he was hiding from all the fucking creditors and lawsuits and warrants, and he had a lot to hide from.
I never thought I would have anything in common with the Klan and the mob, but I really don't like this dude.
So he goes into hiding for a couple years. Eventually he'd emerge, and he had the plan to pursue the publication of this work titled The Law of Success, the one that he claimed that he and Mellett were collaborating on. He arranged a meeting with a publisher named Andrew Pelton, who was a true believer in the self-help movement, but had also, as a publisher, already seen sales success publishing self-help books. So even though Hill had never met Pelton, that never fucking stopped Hill before, Pelton seemed like the perfect guy to go to with your idea for your self-help book. The problem is, it's hard to convince anybody that your self-help book is any good if your personal life is a mess and you're a penniless buffoon. Like, you show up with like the hobo jacket on and say, my self-help book will change the world.
Let me tell you the secret to my success.
Right. So what did Hill do? He borrowed money from his brother-in-law in order to meet with Pelton in a lavish suite that he rented in a Philadelphia hotel.
Drink tea with your pinky out. And
he was made sure to be seen walking around the lobby brandishing a large wad of cash and generously tipping the staff. So at this point, he has officially turned into a fucking sitcom.
Well, it's a straight up con at that point. Like, that's literally pretending that you're successful, and like that's how all those start.
Right. But apparently it worked, because despite the book being absolutely terrible, Pelton agreed to publish it. And thanks to the wealth of interviews that these books contained from famous wealthy people that talked about their secrets to success that were definitely not completely fabricated by Hill, the book actually started to sell. And at one point he was making the equivalent of $35,000 a month. So for the first time in his entire fucking life, Hill was legitimately wealthy. And by legitimately, I mean, aside from the fact that the books themselves are total con jobs, but I mean, in fairness, if you ask me, pretty much all self-help books, if not all self-help books, are total con jobs. With his money, he bought a huge estate in New York. He and his wife, who you notice I haven't really mentioned much except for when he wants money.
The love of his life, you mean?
Life. which he literally never saw except for when he wanted money, or he'd stop in and apparently they'd like just jump right to it because at this point they have 3 children, but he'd never see her for more than like a week out of a year or so. But he bought this giant estate in New York, and he and his wife and his children moved there. He had plans of creating the first university-sized success school, and also like a villa of fancy homes where other wealthy, successful people could come and like vacation together. So basically like Martha's Vineyard.
That sounds like an anti like X-Men institute. Like, like to
right.
We'll take on those mutants with our own mutants. We're the success men.
So they move in here and they have all these plans, and of course this like town near where he's doing all this is all fucking excited. They're like, oh man, he's going to bring wealthy people here. This will be great for us. But of course Hill couldn't possibly stand living under the same roof of his family for more than a week. So he soon went out touring, doing speaking tours. And then the Great Depression hits. And I thought that would be a good stopping point for this week.
As I hit my Great Depression hearing about this prick.
Right. And as I said last week, there's more.
Fuck him, man. Like, I'll admit I cheated a little bit just to, while you're telling the story, I wanted to see when he died. This story goes on way too long. Like, he should have been shot, like, last episode.
For somebody whose golden rule involves the concept of karma, his life proves that is not a thing.
Yeah, dude, like,
well, yes and no.
I mean, I've never thought of a guy I've wanted to get mowed down with a Tommy gun more than Napoleon Hill.
So why didn't he get axe murdered?
Yeah, totally. Like, fucking poor Moore family. Like, I don't know. I don't know how like someone can just like consistently just bullshit their way to.
Well, yeah, and that's what I was going to say. Keep in mind, because I mentioned it and it came up a couple times, but it plays a much bigger role in the finale next week. But he is considered one of like the fathers, like the great minds of self-help, to the point that he has a foundation out there still pushing his theories. Right.
It's like, it's the best self-help because the first lesson is like, if you bought this book, you're proving my point that people are idiots and you can sell them anything.
If his dying words were the true self-help is just fucking lie about everything and you'll win, I could respect that because that's what he did.
Right.
But that's not, yeah.
And it, it kind of pisses me off because like self-help is like an area of life that like people, you don't turn to those fucking books unless your life's
you're
really
preying
in a
on
dark
people,
place,
right.
And like people are looking to you for empowerment, and you're like, this guy has no qualifications to fucking help anyone except himself, and
even that he sucks at because he keeps like, technically he's managed to stay alive, but he's skated along as a penniless loser that's running from the law his entire life. So it's not like
he has a whole philosophy of just like using people, and like when you see like good acts as like a form of currency, like that's really like I'm laying it on like a little bit, but that is a really disgusting mentality to me. Like when you see like, oh, if I do them a favor, they're going to owe me like twice as much. Like,
right.
That's a really shitty way to look at the world, and to encourage other people to look at the world that way really bothers me.
Like you can imagine this guy would have been probably was a big proponent of slavery. Like, you did them a favor getting them out of Africa, so now they owe you.
Oh, yes, they're going to love you guys for the next 100 years.
Look, it's called business, folks.
Oh, man. Yeah.
So, yeah, part 3, and I promise part 3 will be the finale. I didn't expect it. When I started, I thought it would be a single episode thing, and then I'm like, no, it's going to have to be 2. And I was glad you said that yours was a fuller topic too, because literally as you tweeted me that, I'm sitting here furiously typing, and I look up and I'm like, I'm on fucking page 10 again.
Because he won't die.
And I'd like to say that, like, yeah. And I'd like to say that I got done, so at least this week I get a week off and my notes are already done, but I'm not. Yep. I've got more to write.
All right, yeah. I will have something different. Just I'll be the palate cleanser for Ollie this month, I guess. But we'll be back next week with more shit, more Ollie, and yeah.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks for listening.